My name is Al Frioni. I am Chairman and Commissioner of the Pennsylvania Workers' Compensation Appeal Board. This presentation will provide you an overview and some details of the exciting changes coming to the Appeal Board. Recent amendments to the Pennsylvania Code, some which have already taken effect, but the majority of which will take effect later in July 2022, will modify the appeal process and substantially change the practice of workers' compensation law before the board. Where have we been and where are we going? This effort began in 2017 and has been a 5-year effort from the time of the initial discussions, the presentation, the deliberation by the Workers' Compensation Rules Committee, and the receipt of public comment to the approval in 2021 by IRC, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. When implemented in 2022, these will be the most substantial regulatory changes to the Appeal Board in 50 years. In fact, coincidentally, this is the 50th anniversary of the board's existence. Until now, the board's procedures have remained the same since the board's initiation in 1972. Thus, we are providing communication and training to ensure everyone affected will understand the changes and experience a smooth transition. There are basically two components to these changes. First, there's the virtual hearing component. Although plans for virtual hearings were underway, the occurrence of the COVID pandemic greatly expedited the implementation of virtual and electronic hearings. In fact, the transition to virtual hearings has been so successful for the Appeal Board and the Office of Adjudication. The virtual hearing option was incorporated into the new hearing procedures and will be a permanent option offered to the attorneys. The second component is the hot bench provision, which is the major provision of this presentation. This presentation, however, will elaborate on both. With the virtual electronic hearing provision legally taking effect on December 11, 2021, with publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, the board has already received the authority to conduct virtual or electronic hearings. The board always had the authority, in fact, a requirement, to conduct in-person hearings under Section 424 of the Act. And from the time to time, we would conduct a telephonic hearing, but there was no clear authority to do so, and there was no virtual hearings contemplated in 1972. So the regulations now make it clear that the board has the affirmative authority to conduct virtual electronic hearings in addition to in-person hearings. Now, with this new authority for virtual hearings, the board has begun a scheduling transition. Many of you are accustomed to receiving the little white scheduling cards that contain information on which dates the board will be conducting hearings in a particular location, maybe Harrisburg, Scranton, or Philadelphia. In January of this year, again 50 years later, the scheduling cards too look much different because there are now 2 sections to the card instead of just 1. The top grid still contains the information on the board's schedule for a particular city, Philadelphia, Scranton, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and Erie. Introduced this year, however, is a new second grid containing the virtual hearing schedule. Let's take a look at that for a moment. Here is the 2022 schedule. The top grid is the traditional in-person hearing schedule to which you are all accustomed. It tells you when, the adage, when will the board be in town to conduct in-person hearings. The bottom grid, however, is the new virtual hearing grid schedule to which I had referred. This grid contains the schedule for those days the board will conduct virtual hearings on Microsoft Teams. You will see that in the top grid, the in-person grid, no longer will the board travel to any location for 2 or 3 days to conduct in-person hearings. In all cities, the board will travel only 1 day every other month to conduct in-person hearings. Thus, we will significantly yield back to the workers' compensation judges' courtroom space, thus avoiding conflicts. In the bottom grid, referring to virtual hearings, you will see that the board has begun a transition to conducting virtual hearings only twice per month. Thus, once the new regulations take effect, virtual hearings will be conducted twice per month, and most importantly, hearings will be conducted on a statewide basis and will not be location specific. Because they are virtual, there is no longer a need to conduct all of the Scranton cases together at one time or all of the Pittsburgh cases, etc. Cases will be listed for hearing according to the FIFO, first in, first out accounting principle. The first to be filed, regardless of where in the state the petitioner resides, they will be the first ones to be listed for hearing. Therefore, as an example, on September 7th, 2022, there can be virtual hearings from Pittsburgh, Scranton, Harrisburg, in Erie, even Williamsport, Johnstown, etc., all on the same virtual hearing list. I want to move now to the major procedural changes that are coming to the appeal board. So the major procedural changes coming to the appeal board have to do with the hot bench rules and procedures. And what does this really mean for the practice? So as an overview, briefs and the new summary of the argument requirement will be submitted by both the petitioner and respondent prior to the appeal board hearing. Let's pause here for a moment to notice the asterisk on July 11th. This is the date that the changes reflecting the new regulations will be implemented. Although you will be notified of the customary quarterly WIKIS release Friday, July 8th, the regulations will not take effect until midnight on Monday, July 11th. Thus, for a short period, the board will try to avoid it by clearing the hearing docket of appeals, but council may have a very few cases in the system under the old regs, but a great majority of your appeals will be under the authority of the new regulations. Now, I want to go through a general overview of the differences you will notice with the new regulations, and then I'll discuss the details momentarily. So first, the petitioner's brief, formerly called the appellant's brief, will be due 30 days after the appeal file date and prior to the date of argument. Secondly, the respondent's brief, formerly the appellee's brief, will be due 30 days after the submission of the petitioner's brief and also prior to the date of argument. Now, in addition to filing the briefs, each party will be responsible for submitting a new summary of the argument, as well as choosing a hearing preference as either in-person, electronic, or you have the ability to waive the hearing. Let's go briefly through the current process to help distinguish between the old process and the new process that we're about to encounter. So as long as one can remember, when the appeal is filed, you'll receive an acknowledgement letter directing that the appellant's brief is due in those customary terms on or prior to the date of hearing. The hearing itself is scheduled about 30 to 40 days prior to the next in-person hearing date in the city closest to the claimant. The appellant's brief would be submitted on or prior to the date of hearing, and the appellee's brief is submitted 30 days after the hearing or 30 days post-hearing. Sometimes the parties would ask for a brief extension at the hearing itself. The process has been informal and pretty flexible. Please note that you have 20 days from the date of the WCJ's decision to file your appeal. That's no change there. That's been the case before, and that will be the case in the future. Under the current process, the hearing is conducted with an average of 72 days. Because the appellant's brief is due on or prior to the date of hearing, the petitioner has 72 days on average to submit their brief. And the appellee has an average of 102 days 30 days after the 72, to submit its brief. This amount of time is going to be greatly reduced in the new process. All right, so let's take a look at the new process. A process that I think you're going to find it's going to be more appellate-like and a little bit less forgiving. So I'm going to go through these steps, and I kind of call them the happy path steps, when everything moves along with no exceptions and both parties are filing briefs on time. We can talk about some of the exceptions a bit later. But in the first box, you're going to see there on the file the appeal. Once the appeal is filed, the board will issue an acknowledgement letter within 24 to 48 hours, along with the petitioner's brief schedule. The petitioner's brief will be due 30 days from the appeal acknowledgement. Again, take note here, under the old regulations, it was due on or prior to the hearing date, or in approximately 72 days. Under the new regs, petitioner's brief will be due within 30 days of the acknowledgement. Let's look at box number 2 with regard to file petitioner's brief. So within the 30 days, the petitioner will first file its brief. Secondly, with the new one-page summary of the argument to be submitted. And 3, they must select their hearing preference. And in a moment or two, we'll look at the WIKIS screens that display these particular actions, but let's go through the rest of the process first. Once the petitioner has filed its brief, it triggers the 30-day clock for the respondent's brief, and in turn, the respondent will perform the same 3 steps: file their brief, file a one-page summary of the argument, and select their hearing preference. Note again, this is not a situation where the petitioner gets 30 days and the respondent gets 30 days thereafter for a full 60 days. If the petitioner does not take the entire 30 days to file its brief, say they file on day 22, the respondent's 30-day period to file its brief begins on day 23. So the petitioner's brief is due 30 days from the acknowledgement. The respondent's brief is due 30 days from the filing date of the petitioner's brief. Thus, in comparison, under the old rules, petitioner may have had approximately 72 days to file its brief, and the respondent about 103. The new rules give the petitioner only 30 and the respondent 30 days from the receipt of petitioner's brief. Once the petitioner's and the respondent's briefs and the summary of the argument is filed for each, or the brief due date is passed, the board will schedule the hearing. Now, the briefs and the summaries of the argument will be submitted to the commissioner prior to the hearing to provide the commissioner time to review them. At the scheduled time and in the venue selected by the parties, the hearing will be conducted with the commissioner having the brief and summary of the argument submitted by each party. Obviously, if both parties select electronic, the hearing will be held virtually. Or if both select in person, it will be held in person. However, if one party selects in person and the other selects electronic, the matrix is set so that in-person takes precedent over electronic. Now, the board can override the party's choice, such as in disfigurement cases, for example, there will always be an in-person hearing before the board. Now, let's take a little bit of a specific look in this example here. When the petitioner files its appeal and receives its acknowledgement letter, the briefing schedule for the petitioner is going to be set. You will see in WIKIS, within the appeal case summary screen on the briefs tab, the brief schedule table will display showing the appeal number, the submitting party, the brief due date, and the brief status is, of course, pending. The hearing preference displays to be determined because the petitioner will select that when they file the brief and the summary of the argument. Moving on to when you're actually ready to upload your brief, there is a three-step process that requires 1, uploading your brief, 2, uploading the summary of the argument, or as an alternative, you may paste it into the text box. And 3, you will need to select your hearing preference. Now, all 3 actions are performed on the same screen. Now, I'll walk you through each part of the screen separately so you can see the example slightly better. So first, the function of uploading your brief under the new regulations is no different than it is under the current system. Select brief as the document type and then click Upload Brief or Upload Document. Next, you must submit the summary of the argument. That's the new requirement. You have 2 options to accomplish this. You can upload the 1-page document just like you uploaded the brief. The only difference is you select the summary of the argument document type. Now there's an alternative. You can also copy and paste the summary of the argument into the text box. So for those litigants that may have already included a summary of the argument in their brief, it still must be uploaded separately. The summary of the argument still must be uploaded separately. So you can easily open your brief document, copy the summary of the argument, and then return to this screen and paste it into the box, into the text box. The summary is to be no more than 1 page with a maximum of 3,000 characters. So if you exceed that length, you will get a warning message and you'll have to reduce the content. After adding the summary of the argument, you then select your hearing preference. You can see on the drop-down, you have the choice of electronic virtual hearing, in-person hearing, or you can waive the hearing if you want to rest on the brief alone. Just as you choose to waive argument, you can also choose to waive your right to submit a brief, but you must let the board know, otherwise you will be precluded from selecting a hearing preference. Thus, if you do not intend to submit a brief, you can select Not Being Submitted from the drop-down menu back on the Briefs tab. When this option is selected, the hearing preference drop-down will display on the screen and your hearing preference can be selected. Once this option is submitted, WIKIS will automatically move the process forward. These choices can be made based upon what your client desires or what you believe to be in the best interest of your client. When the petitioner uploads their brief, that triggers correspondence for the respondent. As you can see on the updated brief schedule grid on the top line, there's the appeal number, the submitting party, and the brief due date information as before. Now, however, the brief status of the petitioner is updated to reflect that the brief was submitted on April 13th and petitioner chose the electronic virtual hearing preference. Uploading the petitioner's brief or the petitioner missing its brief due date triggers the respondent's brief due date to 30 days after the submission of the petitioner. And the respondent's brief status is pending with their hearing preference to be determined. So just to reiterate the point with regard to the timing of the respondent's brief, let's look at an example. Because the appeal acknowledgement date is April 29th, the petitioner's brief due date comes 30 days after this date, which is May 30th in the example. The respondent will not necessarily get a full 30 days after May 30th to submit their brief. As you see here, the petitioner submitted their brief 12 days early on May 18th. WIKIS then configures the respondent's brief due date 30 days after the petitioner's brief submission, which would be June 17th, not June 30th. Okay, so going back to our first example, once the petitioner submits their brief, correspondence will be generated to both parties with the same information as to the WIKIS brief schedule table, which will document the petitioner's brief submission, the date, the selected hearing preference, and provide the respondent with their brief due date. Notice the comment beneath the grid in bold and to the side in red. Briefs will not be accepted after the brief due date. If no brief is submitted by the due date, WIKIS will automatically update the brief status to no brief received, and the process will continue to move forward. WIKIS will not allow a brief to be uploaded after the due date. So you can see here, the process is shifting from an informal process to a more formal appellate type process. However, a brief extension request is available, and we'll look at that. In the new process, the petitioner and respondent will still have the opportunity to file for a brief extension. This is also done utilizing the same process to which you have been accustomed, utilizing the WIKIS brief tab. One very important note here, however, the regulations were written so that you must request the brief extension before the brief due date, not on the brief due date. So in this case, the respondent's brief due date is May 13th. You cannot go into the system and request the extension on May 13th. You must make the request on May 12th or any time prior. WIKIS will not allow a brief extension request on the brief due date, and an error message will display. Looking at some correspondence, this respondent brief due date notice is a different example to show that this process will also provide for cross appeals. The first two rows show the example and activity we have just discussed. When a cross appeal is filed, however, the respondent also becomes the petitioner, and the petitioner becomes the respondent with separate filings and due dates. In this scenario, if you want to file two briefs, one as petitioner and one as respondent, WIKIS will provide for that. You will also have the option on appeals and cross appeals to indicate that you are not filing a brief, which is common on cross appeals. You will find this option on the same briefs tab in the drop-down where you initiate filing a brief. By doing so, no brief will be required. You will still get the requirement to select a hearing preference, but it expedites the process forward and triggers the next step. Once both briefs are submitted, you will receive a notification that your hearing date range has been established and your hearing is in the process of being scheduled. As shown in this example, you can go to the Appeal Hearing tab on the Appeal Summary screen and view the updated information. Once the hearing time is determined, you will receive the Notice of Hearing correspondence. Here are examples of both the virtual hearing notice and the in-person hearing notice. For electronic hearings, you will receive the date and time information, and separately also receive a Microsoft Teams invite as indicated in the notice. The in-person hearing, however, the notice there will contain the date, the time, and of course, the location of the hearing. So the next steps. Changes are scheduled to be implemented in WIKIS on July 11th. And training resources, supporting documents, and FAQs as they are developed will be distributed via email in June and will be available in WIKIS once the changes go live in July. I'm sure many of you will have questions. If you do, please contact the Appeal Board at the email resource account, or you can call us at the phone number provided on your screen. I really wish to thank you for your time and attention today.